Please welcome Kurt Schneider and Rebecca Souza.
Hi, everyone. I'm Rebecca, and I'm here with my colleague, Kurt. And we're here to talk to you about our custom permission model that we built using relationship access rules.
So we are our Sandia National Laboratories. We are a federally funded research and development center operated by NTES, which is a subsidiary of Honeywell International, for the U.S. Department of Energy and the National Nuclear Security Administration. We are a multi-mission science and engineering laboratory, and our fiscal year 19 budget was approximately $3.8 billion. The lab serves many missions. The main one is nuclear deterrence, which involves nuclear weapons and related programs. And these all require cradle-to-grave system lifecycle responsibility, which is also shared with other design agencies and production agencies. Our other missions are global security, national security, defense systems, and of course, energy. And all these programs also require cradle-to-grave system lifecycle responsibility for many first-of-a-kind and one-of-a-kind systems. And some of these others are the Department of Defense, of course, the State Department, Department of Homeland Security, and of course, Department of Energy. We have deployed and we support multiple ARIS innovator solutions here at the labs. One of these solutions in particular is a document and quality management system, which is used for tracking and process control of very safety critical operations and data. And it's imperative that this data isn't inadvertently created, modified, or deleted. So we need a clear and accurate audit trail of any changes to the system.
So the problem that we had to address is that in creating this system for our internal customer, they require access control to certain relationship items based on a wide variety of these items, such as metadata values of the item itself, the user role of the person trying to modify these relationships, the type of relationship, and then even the life cycle state or the workflow activity that the item is in. And at the time of our solution implementation, we found that the built-in permission model in ARIS didn't meet these specific requirements of what our customer needed. So we needed to create our own custom model of permissions.
So we dabbled with many solutions, looking at the ARIS configuration, and then kind of thought up a different approach to this. And that would be just to use a custom item type and just use ARIS out-of-the-box solution to do this. And so what we came up with is a new item type called a relationship access rule. And all this is just a custom item type, which now someone just interacts with an ARIS item form to create this rule. So any of these rules are just instances of this item type. And so we present the user the source item type and the related item type, which is just your relationship. And then the group identity or individual identity or role that this rule pertains to. And then whether the identity or the role can delete, update, or add one of these relationships. And then down here we have, say, a where area, and this is with our metadata values. Basically, the type of document, in this case, the type of document that we're dealing with, what the lifecycle state of the item is, and whether a certain activity in the workflow has been completed. So over there on the form, they basically said, well, I need to create a rule for this person, and then they fill out the form and save the item.
So this is just a small sample of the spreadsheet that we use to define the access rules. We worked on this together with the customer. So you can see going along the top, you have different types of documents, different states that they would be in, different types of users and their roles, and then whether they can add, delete, or update. And then the rows are the types of relationships from the document to another item. So each set of 3 cells is an individual rule. And you would use this spreadsheet and the rows and columns to input the data into the form that was shown on the previous slide. Each one of these rules would be an individual item of our custom item type.
Okay, so now a little bit about the nuts and bolts of how this works is, so in addition to the configuration of an item type and a form, we use basically 3 events. And an event is triggered when a user attempts to delete, add, or update this relationship. So the above events are bound to the following methods. There's a client-side JavaScript method and a server-side C# method. So the events are essentially on delete row grid event, an on before new client event, and then a server-side on before update. So we use basically 3 methods to achieve this entire access control. And at the very end of the process is just a C# method. It's essentially, we call it our rules engine, which goes and gathers the data, makes the decision on whether the user has access or not, and it returns a 1 or a 0. That's pretty much how it works behind the scenes. Oops. I think I'm fighting you here.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right. So basically, this is what will happen is a user will go, say, to the document item type. They'll try to make some modifications to its relationships to add, modify, or delete. And then they'll try to save it. And that's when the rules engine kicks in. So if you cannot perform the action, you'll get this error message saying that you do not have permission to, say, add these relationships. But if the rules engine comes back with, yes, you can, then it will just save and it will update that relationship.
So we'd like to field some questions now. Okay, so one question was how has this eased the operation and maintenance part of the project? And what it's done is since this is done with basic item type, there's no configuration to export from one environment to the next. So once the rules are in place, it's just a matter of going in and managing the rules within the item type. So there's no configuration that we have to push every time we have to release a change. And the nature of this project is that, this stuff is very fluid and there's always changes on access control. So it does make it easier from an O&M standpoint.
There's a question here. Did you manage to handle complex rules? So the complexity, I would say, is in that whole spreadsheet. Like I said, this was only a very small portion of the very large spreadsheet that we had. But once we defined it, there were certain parameters that the rule could be based on. What type of document, what state it's in, etc. And then the complexity is just in figuring out every single combination of all of those parameters, creating them in that spreadsheet, and then entering those all into the form.
Okay, so another question, an interesting question is IT creating the rules or the individual departments? In this particular project, we have a strict administrative role that actually creates or modifies these rules. But in any other scenario, in another application, the individual users, someone with the privilege or someone who has the authority to do so can just go ahead and manage these things. And, they don't have to call the development team or the project team to push another configuration, which with ARIS would be permission items, MAC policies, those kinds of things. But you have to push a configuration to do that. So I guess the answer to that is yes. In our particular case, IT is managing the rules, but only because of the nature of the project.
There's a couple of questions asking about how long it took for us to implement this. Probably the part that took the longest was actually communicating with the customers, filling out this whole spreadsheet, determining what they wanted those rules to be. And then, of course, adding each individual rule doesn't take very long. But as you can see here, we have hundreds of these rules to cover every scenario. So that part probably took a couple of days just to enter all of those rules. But the nice thing is that once it's set up, it's really easy to change later on. So it definitely saves time in the long run.
So another interesting one, just to be clear, you were able to customize ARIS out of the box to do this. Yes, there's absolutely, there's no external dependencies. There's no other application that we're using to do this. It's just basic creating a custom item type and then using the events, client and server events, and then the built-in methods to do this. So yes, it's definitely just right out of the box, ARIS Innovator.
So here's a question asking if we could walk through the spreadsheet and show how it maps to the item type. So let's start. let's see what would be a good. So if you look in the first column, procedure draft state, and then if you look at row 8, it says related documents, and then look at the first 3 cells. So that column corresponds to IM, or information management. So they are sort of more privileged users in the solution. So when this type of document called a procedure is in the draft state, then we would want them to be able to add and delete related documents, but not to update them. So if we go here, the way that corresponds to this item type, the source item type would be document. The relationship would be related document, like it says there. This role, instead of author, like it says on the slide, the drop down, we would go and select IM. For the can, add, delete, and update, we would check the boxes for add and delete and uncheck the one for update. The document type, we would select procedure, and the source item state is draft. And we would uncheck that box, IMQA approval step completed. That's a step in the workflow. So we would leave that unchecked. And then if you keep looking in row 8, it just so happens that general users do get the same permissions as IM, where they can add, delete, but not update a related document. So you would fill out another form that would be basically the same as the previous one, except under role, you would choose general users.
So another question is, did your development team consider using MAC or DAC policies as part of the solution? Yeah, we did. We looked at using the MAC policies when we started the project, and we had a little difficulty with relationships, getting it to do what we wanted it to do. Doesn't mean that that's not a great solution as well, but I think even today, I still think the way we did it was better because it's easier to manage. We don't have to have an IT person or a developer change a MAC rule and then have to deploy it. And so that was probably our, the major decision in going with our own solution.
This question asks how the rules interact with the lifecycle and workflow to automate the access. So basically the way that it works is when you save the item, everything about the item goes into the rules engine, say its lifecycle state and the place that it is in the workflow. And then it queries that against the rule. It checks, this rule says that if it's in this state and in this part of the life or the life cycle and the workflow. So that's how they interact is you start with the item, wherever it is in the life cycle or workflow, it finds the rule that corresponds to it being in that life cycle and workflow, and it'll return the answer based on that.
Okay, so another question, are there any performance concerns here, particularly with large numbers of simultaneous users of data sets? We have not seen anything out of the ordinary as far as performance with the solution. I think we have probably roughly now about 100 to 150 users accessing this through the RS client. So the answer would be no, not yet. We haven't found any any performance issues using this methodology.
This question asks if we also have rules to hide relationship rows. And not using this implementation, we do have ways to hide and show different relationship tabs based on what type the original item is and various other parts of metadata. But that's sort of a different part of our solution. These rules just affect whether you can add, update, or delete a relationship.
So another question, is the access rule document you showed programmed into the C# method, the rule engine? And is that access control piece of code embedded into Eris? I think Rebecca may have answered this before, but each row in that spreadsheet, you can just kind of translate that to an instance of a rule of that item type. And then all the rules engine does is it takes some information that gets passed in from the calling method, and then it just queries that item type, that relationship rule item type, to see whether all those conditions are met. And if those conditions are met, it just says, hey, everything, we're happy, we return a 1. If any of that stuff does not apply, then it just returns a 0. So the answer would be, it's not really hard-coded anywhere. It's basically just querying that relationship rule, and also using some information that gets passed in. Obviously, one of those pieces is, who am I? Who's logged in? Who's running the method?
This question asks, what were your biggest challenges when adding new item types and custom requirements? So Eris makes it pretty easy to add a custom item type. That part is very easy. Probably the biggest challenge would be actually writing the rules engine, coding that to check against the rules. But once that is set up, everything else you can do with out-of-the-box Eris, and that's very easy.
Here's a real good question. Do you plan migration to version 12? Then you can hide or disable, add, edit, remove the buttons easily with the CUI. That's a really good question, because we've dabbled with the customizable user interface, and we're now running version 11. And there were a lot of things that weren't completed with the CUI in version 11. And we do plan on migrating to version 12. In fact, we've already ported one of our biggest solutions over to version 12, and we're in the process of doing that now. But I still think even by removing or adding or playing with the buttons, I still think you'd have the constraint if you've got to figure out all this other information on whether to hide that button. So, not remembering how that CUI works, real at the top of my head, but I still think we'd have difficulty determining all this as to whether we hide it or not.
Here's a question on how many roles we have in total. So I would say probably half a dozen to a dozen. We have things like you can see on this slide. You have IM or information management, general users, just regular management. And then in the parts of the spreadsheet that you can't see, we have other things like, the author of the document, things like that. So there's it does add up to making quite a lot of rules to cover every single possibility. I think I said before, we probably have around at least 200 to 300 rules. Because remember, each of those 3 cells corresponds to 1 rule.
So another question, is there anything you would do differently if you had to do it again? I would say probably. I still like the solution we came up with. We may have done the implementation a little bit differently. But I still think, given what we know now, we would probably still use the same solution, considering the fine-grained access control. Like I said, the other solution would have been to use MAC policies. But then, we have the deployment where anytime something needs to change, we'd have to go deploy it using, package manager or something like that. So I guess, yeah, we probably would have done maybe the solution that we came up with a little bit differently. There's always better ways to do things. But I would say, as far as the complete solution, I'm happy with the solution we came up with.
So then we have a question asking about the where section of the relationship access rules and how configurable that is. So we did design these rules to be used with different item types, but we did mostly end up using it for documents because they were the items that had the most complex requirements. So a lot of those items in the where section are oriented towards the source item type being a document. What type is it? What item state is it? Where is it in the document workflow? But if we did want to modify it to be, a little more broadly usable for different item types, then we certainly could. We could even make another custom item type. Like this could be the document relationship access rules. And then we could make another one for, parts, some sort of engineering item. So it's all pretty configurable. This is just what we ended up with for our solution. So I think we've covered all of the questions in the chat, and we're just about out of time here. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming to our presentation.